The tree was younger than the tractor. That was the first thing Earl Mercer noticed. Its trunk had grown against the left rear wheel, pressing into the dead rubber as if the land itself had begun swallowing the machine. 35 years. That was how long the tractor had been sitting behind the collapsing equipment shed. Both rear tires were flat. The front wheels had sunk several inches into the soil. Weeds wrapped around the axle. Rust covered the hood, fenders, exhaust stack, and nearly every exposed bolt. 2 years earlier, a scrap dealer had come to look at it. He left without taking it. Too difficult to reach. Too heavy to drag out. Too little steel value after the trouble. But 72-year-old Earl wasn't looking at the rust. He was looking for something more important. A reason. When did it last run? Earl asked. The owner scratched his chin. Late 80s, maybe 89. What happened to it? Nothing really. Dad parked it. Earl looked up. Why? We bought a newer tractor. That answer stopped him. Machines that died violently usually left clues. A hole in the block. A seized engine. Burned wiring. Oil where oil shouldn't be. But a tractor that had simply been replaced. That was different. Earl walked around the machine slowly. The hood was badly oxidized but still intact. The exhaust stack had nearly rusted away at the top. He shined a flashlight down the pipe that concerned him. An uncovered exhaust could give rain a direct path toward the engine. Enough moisture, enough time, one rusted cylinder could lock the entire thing solid. 35 winters were enough time. The owner watched him. You want me to find a battery? No, you don't want to see if it'll crank. Earl lowered the flashlight. Not yet. He crouched beside the engine. The oil pan was rusty but intact. No obvious crack in the block. No connecting rod had punched through the casting. Inspected the cylinder head, freeze plug areas, transmission housing, and the ground beneath the machine. Nothing proved the tractor was healthy, but nothing yet explained why it had been abandoned either. You really think it'll run? The owner asked. Earl remained crouched. I don't know.
And what are you looking for?
Earl wiped dirt from the side of the block. The reason it doesn't. He pulled the dipstick. It resisted after decades without movement. Earl worked it gently until it came free. Black oil coated the end. Old, dirty, expected. Earl was interested in what wasn't obvious. No thick gray emulsion suggesting the crankcase had filled with water. No visible metallic glitter. Not good news, just the absence of one kind of bad news. Then Earl looked back at the exhaust. Something caught his eye. A faint circular line surrounded the rusted pipe several inches below the top. He rubbed it with his thumb. The oxidation above and below the line was different. Was there something over this? The owner frowned. The exhaust? Yeah, he thought for a moment. Dad used to put a coffee can over it. Earl looked at him. For how long? No idea. Now Earl had his first real clue. A coffee can wasn't preservation. It didn't mean the cylinders were clean. It didn't mean the engine wasn't seized. But if that exhaust had been covered during the tractor's early years sitting outside, rain may not have had the open path into the engine that Earl feared. He moved toward the rear transmission housing, hydraulic case, drawbar. Then he stopped. The hole in the drawbar was badly elongated on one side. Earl ran his thumb over the worn steel. Rust hadn't done that. Sitting hadn't done that. Pulling had. Thousands of loads, years of work. This tractor hadn't spent its life parked safely inside a barn. It had earned its wear. The owner kicked one of the flat tires. $100 and it's yours. Earl looked at the dead rubber, the tree against the wheel, weeds around the axle, then back at the engine. 100? If you can get it out. Earl nodded. The owner smiled. So you think the engine's good? No. You think it's seized? Don't know that either. The man's smile disappeared. Then what exactly are you buying? Earl looked at the tractor one more time. 35 years of rust could explain why it looked dead today. 35 years of moisture could explain corrosion. 35 years of sitting could explain ruined fuel, stuck parts, rotten wiring, and failed seal. None of those things answered the question that mattered most. What had happened before those 35 years began? Earl handed him the $100, then pointed toward the engine. 35 years sitting tells me what happened after they stopped using it. He wiped the rust from his fingers. It doesn't tell me why they stopped. The owner glanced toward the tractor. Earl picked up his flashlight. That was the question he'd just bought for $100, and until he knew the answer, nobody was touching the starter. Earl's first rule was simple. Don't ask a machine to move until you know what might be stopping it. The next morning, the tractor was still exactly where it had spent the last 35 years. Earl wanted it that way. No battery, no jumper cables, no starter, not yet. He began with the oil. The dipstick had shown old black lubricant, but that told him almost nothing about what was hiding at the bottom of the pan. Earl loosened the tube carefully. At first, nothing. Then a thick black drop formed. Another followed. Finally, a slow stream of oil entered the pan beneath him. Earl watched the first few seconds closely. He was looking for water. Metal, anything that suggested the engine had suffered a failure before it was parked. The oil was filthy. But there was no obvious flood of water, no chunks of metal, no immediate explanation for why the tractor had stopped working. Ray, the owner's neighbor, watched from behind him. So that's good. Earl didn't look up. It means I haven't found the bad part yet. Next came the cooling system. He removed the cap and shined a light inside. Dry was expected after decades, but dry created another question. Had the coolant simply disappeared during 35 years of neglect, or had the tractor already been losing it when someone parked it? Earl wrote one word in his notebook. Then he moved to the spark plugs. The first came loose reluctantly. Dark, dry. The second looked similar, so did the third. Then Earl removed number 4. He stopped. Ray leaned closer. What? Earl held the plug beneath the flashlight. Corrosion, not catastrophic, but different enough from the others to matter. Looked into the cylinder, then back at the rusted exhaust stack. Moisture had reached one cylinder. Forcing the engine with the starter could turn a manageable problem into a damaged one. That was why the battery was still sitting in Earl's truck. He added penetrating oil to each cylinder. Number 4 received special attention. Then he waited. Ray stared at him. That's it? For now, you drove all the way out here to pour oil into 4 holes? Earl smiled. I drove out here to avoid breaking something I haven't diagnosed. While the oil worked, he inspected the tractor's controls. The clutch pedal moved. Its free travel felt wrong. The gear lever resisted before finally shifting. The throttle linkage was stiff. Old wiring insulation cracked when Earl touched one section. Everywhere he looked, 35 years had left fingerprint. Earl kept separating those fingerprints from the original mystery. Cracked wiring could happen while sitting. Stuck linkage could happen while sitting. Dry seals could happen while sitting. Even the corrosion in cylinder 4 might have happened long after the tractor's last day of work. None of it answered. Why was it parked? By late afternoon, Earl returned to the engine. He removed a small access cover and studied what movement he could see in the valve train. He found another clue. One valve associated with number 4 didn't behave like the other, sticky, not frozen solid, but reluctant. Ray folded his arms. Bad engine? Earl shook his head. Bad question. What? I'm not trying to decide if the engine is good or bad. He pointed toward the cylinder. I'm trying to find out what 35 years did to it before I confuse that with what happened 35 years ago. That distinction changed everything. Earl packed away the plugs. The next test would finally require force, but not starter force, not battery force. His hand. He brought out a long breaker bar and fitted it to the crankshaft. Ray looked at the tool. Going to turn the whole engine with that? If it'll let me, and if it doesn't? Earl placed both hands on the bar. Then I want to feel why. He applied pressure. Nothing moved. Earl stopped immediately. Ray looked at him. Seized? Earl tightened his grip. Maybe. He applied pressure again. Slowly this time the breaker bar moved barely a few degrees, then it stopped. Earl froze. 35 years of silence had just answered him. The engine wasn't completely locked, but something inside was fighting back. The next morning, they found Earl standing beside the tractor with a breaker bar in his hand. The battery was still sitting untouched on the bench. You finally going to turn it? Earl nodded. By hand, he removed the valve cover first. Ray sighed. I thought we were checking the engine. We are. Under the cover, 35 years had left a brown film across the valve train. Earl wasn't looking for clean metal. He was looking for movement. If a valve had rusted in place, forcing the crankshaft could turn a promising engine into a damaged one. Pressed against the first rocker, then the next. He worked through them slowly. One made him stop. The valve beneath it wasn't returning, the way the others did. Earl pressed again, slow, sticky. Ray leaned closer. Stuck? Maybe. Bad? Depends what we do next. Earl applied penetrating oil around the valve stem. Then he waited. No hammer, no starter, no attempt to force 35 years of corrosion to surrender in 30 seconds. While the oil worked, Earl inspected the rest of the valve train. Nothing appeared broken. No snapped rocker. No obvious bent pushrod. No loose piece of metal waiting to fall into the engine. That mattered. A neglected engine could still be repairable. A broken engine usually left evidence. So far, Earl had found neglect, not destruction. He returned to the sticky valve, worked it carefully. A little movement. Oil again. More movement. After several cycles, it began returning on its own. Earl watched it twice more before moving on. Ray smiled. So now we use the starter? Earl pointed at the breaker bar. This is the starter. He fitted it to the crankshaft, then stopped. This was the moment that mattered. If the crank refused to move, Earl wouldn't simply pull harder. Resistance had information in it. Force could erase that information by breaking something. He placed one hand on the bar, applied pressure. Nothing. Ray stared. Earl released it. He tried gently in the opposite direction. Still nothing. Seized, Ray said. Earl shook his head. Resistance. What's the difference? Haven't found out yet. He returned to the 4th cylinder, the one with visible rust, more lubricant. Then he left the tractor alone. Half an hour later he came back. Pressure again. Nothing. Earl changed direction this time. Something moved, barely. Ray leaned forward. Did it? Earl released the bar immediately. He marked its position with chalk, then tried backward. The crank returned almost to the mark. Forward again. A few degrees farther. Earl stopped. That tiny movement told him more than a starter spinning the engine ever could. The crankshaft wasn't welded in place by rust. At least one piston could move. The bottom end wasn't completely locked, but something was still resisting. Earl worked the crankshaft back and forth through the small range, never forcing it past the point where resistance increased. Each cycle moved slightly farther, 5 degrees, 10, then 20. Rust and old deposits were beginning to surrender. Ray reached toward the bar. "Give it some muscle." Earl pulled it away. "No, we know it moves. We know it moves here." Earl pointed toward the engine. "We don't know what happens when another piston reaches the top." That was the danger. An engine could rotate partway and still have a cylinder full of corrosion. A stuck valve could become a collision. A ring could be bonded to one section of bore. Partial movement wasn't freedom. It was permission to investigate farther. Earl removed the breaker bar and checked the valves again while rotating through the safe range. Movement appeared where he expected it. Then, as the crank advanced farther than before, Earl felt the resistance change. He stopped instantly. Not a hard metallic stop. Something softer, uneven. He looked toward the fourth cylinder. Ray noticed. "That one again?" Earl nodded. He added more lubricant and waited. By late afternoon, the breaker bar had traveled almost half a revolution, then 3/4. Each time Earl reached resistance, he reversed slightly instead of overpowering it. Finally, just before sunset, the crank passed the point that had stopped him all day. The bar moved. Earl followed it. Slowly, he stopped exactly where he'd begun. Ray grinned. "Engine's good." Earl removed the breaker bar. "No." Ray's smile faded. "It just turned all the way around." "That means it turns." Earl looked at the rusted tractor. Nothing more. Compression was still unknown. Oil pressure was unknown. Bearings were unknown. Fuel and ignition hadn't even entered the conversation. But after 35 years of silence, the engine's internal parts had completed one full mechanical cycle by hand. That was enough to change the project. Earl picked up the fourth spark plug. The corroded one, the crankshaft, had turned. But the resistance he'd felt near that cylinder hadn't disappeared completely. Something inside was still different, and before Earl allowed the starter to make even one revolution, he intended to find out why. The engine had turned once. Earl wasn't impressed. If the one revolution proved only one thing, nothing inside had stopped it completely. It did not prove the engine was healthy. The next morning, Earl returned to the crankshaft with the breaker bar. Ray stood beside him. "Thought we already proved it turns." Earl put both hands on the bar. "We proved it turned once." He pulled. The crankshaft moved smoothly through the first quarter turn. Then the resistance increased. Earl stopped immediately. There it was again. Same area, same hesitation. He reversed direction slightly. The resistance eased. Forward again. It returned. Ray watched. So something still stuck? Something still different. That difference mattered. If decades of rust had seized a piston badly, Earl expected the resistance to follow the piston through the cylinder. If a bearing had suffered serious damage, the pattern might feel different again. But Earl already had one suspicious clue. Cylinder 4. Its spark plug had shown more corrosion. Its valve had been reluctant to move. Now the crankshaft was telling him where to look next. Old oil coated the mechanism beneath it. He turned the crank again while watching the valves move through their cycles. 1, 2, 3, then number 4. The valve moved, but not like the others. It descended. Hesitated. Earl stopped turning. Ray leaned over the engine. "That it?" "Part of it." Earl worked penetrating oil around the stem and began moving the engine through a small range by hand. Forward, back, forward again. He wasn't trying to overpower the sticky valve. He was trying to free it without bending something that had survived 35 years intact. Gradually the movement changed. The hesitation became shorter. The valve returned faster. Earl rotated the crank through another complete revolution. This time the tight spot was smaller. Again better. Again almost even. Ray smiled. "So now it's free." Earl removed the breaker bar. Freer. That was enough for the next test. He wasn't installing the spark plugs. He wasn't connecting a battery. Instead, Earl wanted to know whether the engine could still move oil. An engine turning dry after decades could damage itself long before it ever fired. Prepared the lubrication system, then rotated the engine without asking it to start. At first, nothing appeared where Earl was watching. He continued. Slowly, then oil. A small amount reached the upper engine. Earl stopped, checked again, repeated the test. More oil appeared. That changed the situation. The engine could rotate. The valve train was moving more consistently, and the lubrication system was showing signs of circulation. For the first time, Earl had 3 pieces of evidence pointing in the same direction. But then he noticed something else. With the plugs removed, each cylinder pushed air as he turned the engine. One felt different. Earl placed his thumb over the 4th spark plug hole and rotated the crank. The pressure built, but not like the others. He repeated it. Same result. Ray saw his expression. "What now?" "Number 4 again." "Low compression?" "Feels like it." "Because of the valve?" Earl looked at the open valve train. "Maybe. But the valve was moving far better now. If number 4 still couldn't build pressure, the 35-year-old rust might not be the entire explanation." Earl reached for a compression gauge. For 2 days, every suspicious clue had pointed toward the same cylinder: the corroded plug, the sticky valve, the uneven resistance, now weak pressure. That could mean one problem causing everything, or several problems layered on top of one another across decades. Earl threaded the gauge into cylinder 4. Ray looked toward the tractor. "You think this is why they parked it?" Earl paused. That was the question. A stuck valve could happen during 35 years of sitting. Corrosion could happen during 35 years of sitting, but weak compression might have a history that began much earlier. Earl tightened the gauge, then looked at Ray. Now we're finally testing something that might have been wrong before it stopped. For the first time since buying the tractor, Earl wasn't investigating what 35 years had done to it. He was getting close to what might have happened on its last working day. The compression gauge confirmed it. Cylinder 1 built pressure. Cylinder 2 was close. Cylinder 3 followed. Then Earl tested number 4. The needle climbed and stopped well below the others. Ray stared at the gauge. "So that's it." Earl looked at him. "That's what? Why they parked it?" Earl removed the gauge. "No," Ray frowned. "You just found a bad cylinder. I found a weak cylinder. Those were not the same conclusion." Number 4 had already given Earl more trouble than anything else in the engine. The corroded spark plug, the sticky valve, resistance while turning the crank, now lower compression. It would have been easy to connect those clues into one clean story. Cylinder 4 failed. The tractor lost power. Someone parked it. Too easy. Because 35 years could create most of the evidence Earl was looking at. He needed to know whether number 4 had been weak before the tractor stopped, or whether decades of sitting had made it weak afterward. So he tested it again. Same result. Then Earl added a small amount of oil to the cylinder and repeated the compression test. The reading changed, not enough to give him a simple answer. Ray watched him write the numbers down. "What does that mean?" "It means I keep looking." Earl removed the valve cover again. This time he wasn't interested in whether the valve moved. He wanted to know whether it closed. A valve could appear to move normally and still fail to seal properly. After decades of corrosion, even a small amount of contamination on a sealing surface could reduce compression. He rotated the engine slowly, watched number 4, stopped, repeated. Then he removed what he needed for a closer inspection. That was when he noticed the marks. Not rust, not age, tool marks, old ones. A fastener near number 4 had been disturbed before. Another showed the same thing. Someone had worked in this area long before Earl arrived. He wiped the metal clean. The marks remained. Ray leaned closer. "Factory?" Earl shook his head. "Somebody's been in here. When?" "No idea." That changed the mystery. A sticky valve after 35 years was expected. Evidence of an old repair was not. Earl began inspecting the surrounding components more carefully. Nothing screamed catastrophic failure. No broken valve spring. No obvious destroyed component. But number 4 was no longer just the cylinder that had suffered most from sitting. It might have had a problem before the sitting ever began. Ray pointed toward the tractor. "So I was right. About what?" "They parked it because of number 4. Earl shook his head again. "Still don't know." He walked back to the workbench and opened 4. He wrote, "Low compression. Valve had been sticking. Old tool marks." Then beneath them, cause or consequence. That was the question now. The engine could turn. It could move oil. Most of the valve train was behaving better. But number 4 carried evidence from 2 different periods of the tractor's life. Some damage clearly belonged to 35 years of silence. Other clues might be older. Earl needed something that could separate those timelines. He looked down at the drained engine oil sitting in the pan, toward the transmission housing, then at the clutch pedal. If the engine had been failing badly enough to retire the tractor, other evidence might support that story. If it didn't, then Earl had been looking in the wrong place. He walked over and pressed the clutch pedal slowly. The pedal moved farther than he expected. Earl stopped, pressed it again. Same thing, Ray noticed. "What?" Earl crouched beside the linkage. The adjustment was nearly at its limit. He stared at it for several seconds. Cylinder 4 had looked like the answer. The tractor had just given him another suspect. Earl stood. Maybe we're asking the engine to explain a decision the engine never made. And for the first time he turned his attention away from cylinder 4. The old oil had been sitting in Earl's drain pan overnight. That was useful. By morning, anything heavier than the oil had begun settling toward the bottom. Earl poured the upper layer slowly into another container, then stopped. Dark layer remained behind. Ray arrived just as Earl dragged a magnet beneath the pan. "What are you looking for?" "The kind of dirt that shouldn't be dirt." 35-year-old oil was supposed to look terrible. Black oil didn't frighten Earl. Sludge didn't automatically frighten him either. What mattered was what was inside it. Bearing material, steel fragments. Pieces large enough to suggest something had been destroying itself before the tractor was parked. Earl moved the magnet slowly. A few tiny particles followed it. Nothing surprising for an engine this old. No teeth, no chunks. Obvious evidence that the bottom end had torn itself apart. He rubbed some of the settled material between his fingers, then wiped them clean. Ray looked at the pan. "So the engine's good?" Earl shook his head. The oil didn't tell me that. What did it tell you? It didn't give me a reason this tractor stopped working. That was becoming important. Earl opened the old filter housing. The element inside looked ancient. He cut it apart and spread the material beneath a light. Again he searched for evidence, metal, bearing material. Anything that could turn the engine into the obvious explanation. He found contamination, old deposits, nothing dramatic. The engine had one weaker cylinder. A valve had been reluctant, there was corrosion from sitting. But Earl still hadn't found the kind of failure that made a farmer park a useful tractor and never return to it. So he stopped looking at the engine. He walked to the fuel tank. The cap resisted before breaking free. The smell answered the first question immediately. Ray stepped backward. That can't be gasoline anymore. It isn't anything I'd put through a carburetor. Earl drained a sample into a glass jar. The liquid was dark. Sediment settled beneath it. The tank showed corrosion inside. The fuel line was brittle. When Earl removed the carburetor bowl, dried residue coated the passages. Ray looked at him. Here it is, there's what? Why they parked it? Earl shook his head. This happened because they parked it. That distinction was the entire investigation. Bad fuel after 35 years explained why the tractor wouldn't run today. Didn't explain why someone shut it off for the last time in 1989. Earl moved on. Transmission oil, hydraulic fluid, clutch linkage, electrical system. He wasn't repairing yet, he was separating old failures from new decay. The wiring had deteriorated badly in places. Rodents had damaged insulation, years of sitting. The clutch pedal moved but not correctly. Earl crouched, pressed it by hand, released. Then again, something felt wrong. He followed the linkage, old wear, corrosion. But then he noticed the adjustment nearly at its limit. Earl stopped. That was different. Rust happened while the tractor sat. Mouse damage happened while it sat. Old gasoline became varnish while it sat. An adjustment at the end of its usable range belonged to the tractor's working life. Ray saw Earl studying it. What? Somebody was trying to get more clutch. Earl checked the linkage again, then looked through the inspection opening. The evidence wasn't enough yet. It was the first clue he'd found that might predate the tractor's abandonment. He walked back to the engine. 35 years of sitting had made the tractor look guilty everywhere. That was the trap. Most of what they had found wasn't evidence of why it had been parked. It was evidence of what happened afterward. Earl took the cardboard from yesterday. Under what 35 years of sitting damaged, he wrote fuel, wiring, seals, corrosion. Then beneath what made them park it, he wrote only one word: clutch. Ray read it. You think that's it? No. Then why write it? Because it's the first problem we've found that looks older than the silence. Earl looked toward the transmission housing. The engine had captured everyone's attention because an engine that sat 35 years made the better story. But farmers didn't park tractors only because engines failed. Sometimes the engine was perfectly willing to work, and something behind it could no longer put that work into the ground. Earl picked up a wrench. The next thing he intended to inspect had nothing to do with making the engine run. He wanted to know whether 35 years earlier, the engine had ever been the problem at all. Earl removed the clutch inspection cover. Then he stopped. Ray was waiting for him to say something. Instead, Earl aimed the flashlight deeper into the housing. The clutch wasn't merely old, it had been used hard. The linkage adjustment Earl had noticed was nearly exhausted, and the wear inside matched the story. Someone had been compensating for a clutch that was reaching the end of its useful life. Ray crouched beside him. So that's why they parked it? Maybe. They've been saying maybe for 3 days. Because evidence doesn't get better when you're impatient. Earl checked the pedal linkage again. Wear at the pivot. Adjustment pushed near its limit. Signs that the problem had existed while the tractor was still working. This was different from the rotten fuel line or mouse-chewed wiring. Those belonged to the 35 years after the tractor stopped. The clutch wear belonged to the years before. But Earl still wanted one thing mechanical evidence couldn't give him: a witness. He called the property owner. Your father ever complain about the clutch? Silence. I wouldn't remember. Did the tractor stop working in the field? Don't think so. Did anyone tow it back? Another pause. No. I'm pretty sure Dad drove it where you found it. Earl looked at Ray. That mattered. You said you bought another tractor around then. Yeah, before this one was parked or after, the man thought. Before. Now Earl was listening carefully. What was wrong with the old one? Dad said the clutch was getting bad and it was getting harder to start. Hydraulics leaked. Little things all the time. Engine ever blow? No. Knock. Not that I remember. Overheat? No. Then the owner laughed. Don't think there was one big thing wrong with it. Earl said nothing. There it was. Not a dramatic failure, a decision. The owner continued. The new tractor showed up and Dad started using that. He parked the old one behind the shed. For repair, I suppose. When? Had to be 89. Nobody came back to it? A long pause. Guess not. Earl looked across the shop at the tractor. 35 years people had assumed something had killed it. Maybe nothing had. Maybe it had simply become inconvenient at exactly the moment a better machine arrived. A worn clutch, a leaking hydraulic system. Hard starting, a collection of repairs that were possible individually but unnecessary once another tractor was sitting in the barn. Ray shook his head. So it sat 35 years because nobody wanted to fix a clutch? Not exactly. Earl pointed toward the machine. It sat because nobody needed to. That was a very different story. He returned to the tractor and inspected the clutch more carefully. The evidence fit, so did the engine. The crankshaft hadn't been locked by a catastrophic failure. There were no broken internal pieces in the old oil. Reluctant valve and cylinder corrosion were consistent with decades of sitting. Even the ruined fuel system belonged to abandonment, not necessarily the original problem. The tractor hadn't been parked because the engine was dead. 35 years had almost killed an engine that may have been alive when the tractor was parked. Ray looked toward the starter. So now we know. We know more. Same thing. Earl ignored him. He moved to the hydraulic system. The owner had mentioned leaks. Earl found them. Old hoses had hardened. Seals had deteriorated. Dirt-covered areas where hydraulic oil had once collected. Some failures were probably old. Others had worsened during decades of inactivity. Then Earl found something he didn't like. Near one connection, corrosion had gone much deeper than the surface suggested. He cleaned it. More material came away. Ray watched his expression change. Bad enough. Earl continued inspecting. The clutch could be repaired. Fuel could be cleaned. Wiring could be replaced. A sticky valve could be freed. But every system on a tractor this old could hide another reason to stop. Earl had no intention of letting the story decide the repair. He wrote on the cardboard, worn clutch, hard starting, hydraulic leaks, replacement tractor already available. Then underneath, why it may not run again, 35 years of sitting. Ray read the second line, saying sitting might have done more damage than the original problem. Earl nodded. That was the irony. In 1989, the tractor may have needed repairs. In 2024, it needed resurrection from 3.5 decades of neglect. Earl looked at the engine that had already turned by hand. Getting it to rotate had been impressive. It had also been the easy part, because now he knew why the tractor had probably been parked. The next question was harder. After 35 years, what had time destroyed that the farmer who parked it never had to repair? Earl found the leak before he ever tried to start the tractor. That probably saved the engine. It filled the cooling system slowly, expecting trouble after 35 years of dry seals, corrosion, and temperature cycles. At first, nothing happened. Then a green drop appeared beneath the engine. Another followed. Then another. Ray crouched beside him. Radiator? Earl shook his head. Leak was coming from farther back. He moved the flashlight. A thin stream was forming near an old core plug. Ray sighed. That's bad. Earl watched the coolant spread across the metal. No, Ray looked at him. No, it's bad if I ignore it. That distinction mattered. Tractor had already given Earl enough reasons to become emotionally invested. The engine turned. Oil circulated. The clutch wear helped explain why it had been parked. He finally understood that the machine probably hadn't suffered one dramatic failure 35 years ago. Understanding its past did not make it safe today. Earl drained the coolant. Then he went back through the tractor with a different question. Why was it parked? He had enough evidence for that now. The new question was, what could destroy it if I try to bring it back too quickly? The answers came faster than he wanted. The cooling system leak was first, then the fuel system. What remained in the tank no longer smelled like gasoline. It smelled sharp and stale. Earl opened the system farther. Varnish, sediment, contamination. If he simply poured fresh fuel on top and cranked the engine, all of that could travel directly toward the carburetor. He added it to the list. Then wiring. One section of insulation cracked when Earl bent it. Another connection was green with corrosion. A damaged wire near the wrong piece of metal could turn a first start attempt into smoke or fire. Another mark. Then he reached the hydraulic system. One old line looked questionable. Earl wiped it clean. The corrosion beneath the dirt was worse than it first appeared. Ray stared at the growing list on the workbench. Cooling, fuel, wiring, hydraulics. What'd you pay for this thing? $100. Ray laughed, starting to understand why. Earl looked at the tractor. For the first time, he didn't answer immediately. A $100 tractor could become a $1,000 mistake very quickly. The dangerous part wasn't the money already spent. It was using that $100 as an excuse to spend the next $1,000. Earl picked up the chalk and wrote across the top of the list, "Does it still deserve the next repair?" Ray read it. "So you might quit?" "Of course, after everything you've found. Especially after everything I've found." Ray pointed toward the engine. "But you proved it isn't seized." "That doesn't prove the cooling system will hold. The clutch explains why they stopped using it. Doesn't make the brakes work. You've already bought it." Earl looked at him. "The $100 is gone. It doesn't get a vote." That was the rule now. Every repair had to justify the next one. Because Earl wanted a pretty tractor. Not because he wanted to prove he'd been right. Because old machines became dangerous when pride started making decisions. He replaced the failed core plug and inspected the surrounding areas. cleaned the fuel system instead of gambling on it, removed unsafe wiring from the first start equation, addressed the hydraulic line before asking it to hold pressure. Then he stopped. The tractor still looked dead. Flat tires, rust, faded paint, a seat split open by weather. After days of work, Earl had done almost nothing to improve its appearance. Ray looked across the machine. "You going to restore any of that?" Earl followed his eyes across the hood. The rust wasn't stopping the engine from turning. The dents weren't contaminating the fuel. Faded paint couldn't overheat a cylinder, and suddenly Earl knew exactly what kind of restoration this tractor needed. He took the chalk and drew 3 columns on the workbench: run, work, look. He put a line through the third. Ray stared at it. "What does that mean?" Earl reached for his tools. "It means I'm done fixing anything that doesn't help answer whether this is still a tractor." Ray arrived the next morning carrying a paint sample. He held it against the tractor's hood, found the original color. Earl barely looked up. Beneath 35 years of oxidation, the tractor had once been a deep red. Ray had found a supplier who could match it, the sheet metal. Ray said, "Fix the dents. New decals, new seat. When you're done, nobody would know it sat outside for 35 years. Earl tightened a fitting on the fuel system. "That's the problem." Ray lowered the sample. "Nobody would know." He pointed toward the hood. The rust was ugly. The paint was almost gone. One fender had been bent long before the tractor was abandoned. The steering wheel was cracked. The seat had split open and hardened in the weather. None of those things had prevented the crankshaft from turning. None had caused cylinder 4's weak compression. None had ruined the fuel. None had created the cooling leak. Earl walked to the workbench. The 3 words from yesterday were still written in chalk. Run, work, look. He circled the first. To run, it needs clean fuel, lubrication, cooling, ignition, and an engine that can survive being started. Then he circled the second. To work, it needs steering, brakes, clutch, transmission, hydraulics, tires that can carry weight. He tapped the third word. Paint doesn't belong in either list. Ray looked at the tractor. "So you're leaving it like this?" "I'm leaving it 35 years old." That was different from neglecting it. Earl wasn't going to ignore dangerous corrosion. He wasn't going to leave failed wiring because it looked original. And he wasn't going to trust rotten rubber simply because the tractor had survived with it before. Original did not mean safe. New did not automatically mean necessary either. That distinction became Earl's rule. He went through the machine system by system. The contaminated fuel was removed. The tank and delivery path were cleaned. The carburetor received attention where decades of sitting had left deposits. Unsafe electrical connections were repaired before a battery came anywhere near the tractor. The cooling system was checked again after the leaking core plug was dealt with. Then Earl moved lower, steering. He turned the wheel while Ray watched the linkage. Movement appeared in places before the front wheels responded. Where, not surprising, but Earl wanted to know how much. A tractor that started beautifully but couldn't be controlled wasn't restored. It was dangerous. Next came the brakes. The pedals moved. That proved almost nothing. Earl inspected the system instead of trusting pedal movement. Then the clutch. This was different. The clutch wasn't just another repair. It was part of the answer to the mystery. The linkage adjustment had already been pushed nearly as far as it could go. Combined with what Earl had learned about the tractor's final working years, it suggested a machine that had become increasingly inconvenient to keep using. Not one destroyed by a catastrophic engine failure. Earl didn't erase that evidence. He documented it, then repaired what was necessary to make the system functional again. Ray watched him work. "You know what this thing's going to look like when you're finished?" Earl glanced at the tractor. "Like that, after all this work?" "That's the point," Ray laughed. "Most people want a restoration to look restored." Earl put down his wrench. "Then they're restoring something different." He walked to the tractor and placed his hand on the faded hood. "This dent doesn't stop it." He pointed toward the cracked old paint. "That doesn't stop it." Then toward the mechanical systems beneath them. "But bad brakes can." He pointed lower. "Bad steering can." Then toward the radiator. "Overheating can." Finally the engine. And starting an engine before it's ready can. That was where Earl would spend his time, not on making 35 years disappear, on making sure those 35 years didn't destroy the tractor during its first 5 minutes back. By late afternoon, the list on the workbench had become shorter. Fuel system, ready. Cooling, ready for test. Lubrication, wiring, inspected. More testing required before work. Earl stood in front of the final unchecked line. Engine start. Ray saw it too.
"Harry's tomorrow."
Earl nodded. The first time since buying the tractor, nothing obvious stood between him and the ignition system. Ray looked once more at the rusted hood. "You really aren't going to paint it?" Earl erased the word "look" from the workbench. "No, why not?" Earl picked up the battery cables. Because somewhere along the way, he'd realized the tractor didn't need to prove it could become beautiful again. It needed to prove something much harder. That beneath the rust, failed seals, contaminated fuel, weak cylinder, worn clutch, 35 years of silence, it could still be a tractor. Earl set the cables beside the engine. Tomorrow, for the first time in 35 years, he would let the starter turn it. After everything he'd learned by refusing to rush, the tractor would finally get a chance to answer for itself. Earl pressed the starter, the engine turned. Slowly, 1 revolution, 2, 3, nothing. He released it. Ray leaned toward the tractor. That sounded pretty good. It turned. After 35 years, I'd call that good. Earl didn't. The breaker bar had already proved the engine could rotate. The starter had only proved it could rotate faster. What Earl needed now was combustion, and he wasn't going to flatten a battery trying to force it. He checked the fuel. Fresh gasoline was reaching the carburetor. Then ignition. He removed a plug, grounded it properly, and cranked the engine briefly. Spark. Present. Earl reinstalled it. Ray scratched head, fuel and spark. Why doesn't it start? Because having both doesn't mean they're arriving correct. Earl checked the choke, throttle position, ignition timing. Then he looked at the plugs again. One was wetter than the others, number 4, the same cylinder that had bothered him from the beginning. Ray saw Earl studying it. Still that one? Still different. Earl cleaned the plugs and turned the engine by hand once more. The reluctant valve was moving, not perfectly like a fresh engine. Consistently enough to continue. He returned to the seat, second attempt. The starter engaged. Brr 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 cough. Earl released it immediately. Ray's head snapped toward him. That was it. Earl nodded. For the first time in 35 years, something had burned inside the engine. But one cough wasn't a running tractor. Earl climbed down, checked for fuel leaks. Nothing. Checked the wiring. Cool. Looked beneath the engine. No sudden stream of oil or coolant. Then he checked the oil pressure gauge. The needle had moved slightly during cranking. That mattered more to Earl than the cough. The lubrication system was doing something. He climbed back onto the seat. Again, Earl nodded. The starter turned. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught. For less than a second. Silence. Ray grinned. Earl was already off the seat. What now? Find out why it quit. He adjusted the fuel mixture and checked the carburetor again. 35 years of residue didn't disappear because the parts had been cleaned once. A small passage was still restricting flow. Earl cleared it, reassembled everything, then waited. The third attempt began exactly like the first two. Crank, crank, cough. Then the engine fired. The tractor shook. A cloud of gray smoke rolled from the exhaust. The engine stumbled badly, nearly died. Recovered. Ray laughed. It's running. Earl didn't answer. His eyes were on the oil pressure gauge. The needle climbed. Pressure, then the temperature gauge. Still cold. He listened. Ticking. Combustion uneven. A brief miss. Then another. The engine had awakened, but Earl wasn't interested in the drama of the moment. He was listening for reasons to shut it down. Knock. No. Heavy bottom end pounding. No oil pressure disappearing. No coolant pouring out. No. He let it run 20 seconds. 30. The idle began smoothing slightly as fresh fuel moved through the system. The smoke started thinning. Ray stepped closer. 30's one hand. Listen. A tapping noise remained, not violent but regular. Earl moved beside the engine. Valve train, probably. The same area he'd been watched since number 4 first resisted. He returned to the controls. At 45 seconds, Earl shut the engine off. Silence filled the shed. Ray stared at him. Why did you do that? Because it started. That makes no sense. It makes perfect sense. Earl climbed down. He had wanted to know whether the engine could run. Now he knew there was no reason to turn a 45-second test into 10 minutes of unnecessary risk. Heat and oil pressure had changed the conditions inside the engine. Now he could inspect what those conditions revealed. A small coolant seep appeared near one connection. Marked. Fuel fitting was slightly damp. Marked. The valve train needed another check. Marked. Oil pressure had been present. That received a check. Ray looked at the list. You're making notes now? Especially now. A machine sitting still hid problems. A running machine exposed them. Over the next several days, Earl corrected the seep, checked the valve adjustment, cleaned the remaining fuel restriction, and started the engine again. This time it caught faster. Tapping diminished as oil circulated. The idle remained imperfect, but stable. Earl let the engine warm gradually while watching pressure and temperature. 35 years hadn't disappeared. The engine still carried wear from the life it had lived before being parked, but it ran, and that finally proved something important. The tractor had not been abandoned because its engine was dead. The engine had survived long enough to confirm Earl's suspicion. Ray stood beside the rear tire. So we did it. Earl looked toward the transmission. No, the engine idled behind him. For weeks, everyone had been asking whether it would start. That had never been Earl's final question. The tractor wasn't built to sit in a shed running. It was built to put power into the ground. Earl pressed the clutch pedal. Tomorrow, after 35 years, they would find out whether the tractor could move. Earl didn't drive the tractor into the field. He moved it 6 inches. The engine had been warming for several minutes when he pressed the clutch pedal. Then he waited. Ray stood beside the rear wheel. You going somewhere? Maybe. Earl selected first gear. Slowly he released the clutch. Nothing happened. The engine continued idling. Earl pressed the pedal again. Ray's expression changed. Clutch? Earl nodded. They already knew it was worn, now they knew how much. 35 years earlier, someone had adjusted the linkage almost to its limit. Sitting hadn't created that wear, work had. Earl made one final adjustment within the remaining range, then climbed back onto the seat, first gear, clutch out. This time the engine note changed, rear tires pulled against the dirt. For a moment nothing moved, then the tractor rolled forward, 6 inches. Earl pushed the clutch and stopped. Ray laughed. You waited 35 years for 6 inches? Earl looked back at the tracks. No, I waited 6 inches to see if it would stop. He tried again, 3 feet, stop, 10 feet, stop. Then a slow circle around the yard. The steering had play but responded predictably. The clutch engaged late. The brakes required more pedal pressure than Earl liked. Nothing was perfect, but the tractor moved under its own power. It still wasn't the test. Earl shut it down. Again? Now we look. Movement and heat could expose failures that a stationary machine hid. Earl checked the cooling system. No major leak, engine oil, stable transmission. Then the hydraulic connections he'd repaired. Dry, he inspected the clutch linkage again. The adjustment had worked. Earl knew it wasn't a permanent solution. The clutch was worn. 35 years hadn't repaired it. Neither would optimism. Before asking the tractor to work hard, that problem would eventually need proper attention. But Earl had enough information for a controlled test. 2 days later, he backed the tractor toward an old utility wagon. Ray watched him connect it. You sure? It's empty. You could hook something heavier. Earl shook his head. I'm testing a tractor, not proving I'm stupid. The wagon added resistance without demanding everything the machine had. Earl checked the hitch pin, safety connection, tires, brakes, then climbed aboard, first gear, the clutch took hold, the tractor moved. The wagon followed. Earl drove across the flat section behind the barn. No speed, no drama. He listened. Engine load changed. The governor responded. Temperature remained stable. Oil pressure held. At the far end, Earl stopped, then started again. The tractor pulled without complaint. Ray was smiling when Earl returned. So that's it? Earl looked toward an old 3-point implement sitting beside the fence. Not yet. The hydraulic system had been one of the complaints before the tractor was parked. If this machine was going to return to farm work, moving itself wasn't enough. Earl connected a light implement appropriate for the tractor. He started the engine, engaged the hydraulic control. Nothing happened. Ray's smile disappeared. Earl waited, tried again. The arms to run slowly, then stopped halfway. Earl immediately lowered them. Air?
Weak pump?
Control problem? 35-year-old seals? He checked the fluid, then the linkage. The control mechanism wasn't traveling through its full range. Old wear and stiffness were limiting it. Earl cleaned it, lubricated it, adjusted it correctly. Then tried again. The arms rose. This time they continued. The implement lifted clear of the ground. Earl held it briefly, lowered it, raised it again. Ray walked around the tractor. So now it's a tractor again. Earl looked at the faded hood. For weeks they had been obsessed with the engine. Would it turn? Would it build pressure? Would it fire? But an engine running in a shed was only an engine running in a shed. Tractor had a different definition. It had to transfer power, move, pull, lift, stop, do useful work. Earl drove toward a section of the property that needed clearing. The implement lowered. The engine note deepened. For the first time in 35 years, the tractor wasn't being diagnosed, wasn't being rescued. It wasn't proving that an old engine could run. It was doing a job. Ray stood at the edge of the field, watching rusted fenders move slowly away from him. 35 years of weeds had made the tractor look dead, but Earl had finally discovered what everyone had misunderstood. The remarkable thing wasn't that the engine turned after 35 years, it was that when the engine turned, there was still a tractor behind it. Earl didn't repaint the tractor. He didn't replace the dented hood. He didn't polish the grill or cover the faded metal with fresh decals. 3 weeks after the engine first fired, the tractor still looked like something most people would have left behind the shed. That was exactly how Earl wanted it. He drove it back to the property where he'd found it. The previous owner was waiting near the barn. When the tractor came down the gravel lane, the man stared for several seconds. Same rusted fenders, same faded hood, same crooked headlight, but this time the wheels were turning. You got it running. Earl pulled beside the barn and shut the engine off. Yeah, the man walked around it. Rebuild the engine? No new pistons? No, then what was wrong with it? Earl looked at the tractor. That depends which year you're asking about. The man frowned. Earl pointed toward the clutch housing. When your father parked it, the clutch was worn almost to the end of its adjustment. Hydraulics were leaking. It was getting harder to start. Then he pointed toward the engine. But 35 years created a different set of problems: corrosion, bad fuel, stuck components, failed hoses, damaged wiring, deteriorated seals. The tractor Earl dragged home was not exactly the tractor that had been parked in 1989. Time had added its own failures. The owner ran his hand across the hood. So the engine wasn't blown? Doesn't look like it. The man became quiet. Dad always said he'd get back to it. Earl looked toward the collapsed equipment shed. Probably meant to. That was how machines disappeared. Not always with a broken crankshaft. Not always with smoke pouring from the engine. Sometimes a newer tractor arrived. The old one needed a clutch. Then harvest came, then winter, then another year. A machine that had worked for decades could become something nobody needed by simply sitting still long enough. The owner smiled. Earl looked at the rust. "No, you've come this far. I did restore it." The man laughed. "Earl didn't. I restored what it does." He climbed back onto the seat. Behind the tractor was the same field it had worked decades earlier. Earl had brought a light implement with him. Nothing dramatic, nothing selected to make the tractor look stronger than it was. Just work appropriate for an old machine returning to service. He connected it, checked the hitch, started the engine. This time it fired without the long struggle of that first day. The idle, settled oil pressure came up. Earl waited for the temperature to begin moving before selecting gear. Then the tractor entered the field, the implement lowered, the engine note deepened. Behind Earl the ground changed, slowly, steadily. The owner stood beside Ray and watched. There was no fresh paint flashing in the sunlight. No polished chrome, no transformation that could be understood from a before and after photograph. The transformation was happening underneath. The clutch transferred power. The cooling system carried heat away. Oil circulated through an engine that had once been assumed dead. Hydraulics raised and lowered the implement. The tractor pulled, turned, worked. At the end of the first pass, Earl stopped. He checked the gauges, then looked behind him. 35 years ago, this machine had left work unfinished. Now there was a fresh line through the field. Earl turned around, another pass, then another. Ray waited until Earl returned to the barn. "You know what everybody's going to say." Earl shut the engine off. "What?" "That you brought a dead tractor back to life." Earl shook his head. "No." Earl climbed down. "It wasn't dead when they parked it." He glanced at the old owner. That was the part everybody missed. The engine hadn't miraculously survived a catastrophic failure. The evidence suggested there may never have been one. A worn clutch, hydraulic leaks, hard starting. Then a newer machine arrived. What began as temporary storage became 35 years. Those 35 years nearly created the failure everyone later assumed had come first. Earl put one hand on the faded hood. When he'd found the tractor, weeds had grown around the wheels so thickly that it seemed to belong to the ground. Now those same wheels were covered in fresh soil. That was enough restoration for him. For 35 years, everyone who saw the tractor asked the same question. How could an engine survive sitting that long? Earl had asked a better one. Whoever proved the engine was the reason it stopped. Chapter 12. The field it left 35 years ago. Earl didn't repaint the tractor, he didn't replace the dented hood, he didn't polish the grill or cover the faded metal with fresh decals. 3 weeks after the engine first fired, the tractor still looked like something most people would have left behind the shed. That was exactly how Earl wanted it. He drove it back to the property where he'd found it. The previous owner was waiting near the barn. When the tractor came down the gravel lane, the man stared for several seconds. Same rusted fenders, same faded hood, same crooked headlight. But this time the wheels were turning. You got it running. Earl pulled beside the barn and shut the engine off. Yeah, the man walked around it. Rebuild the engine? No. New pistons? No. Then what was wrong with it? Earl looked at the tractor. That depends which year you're asking about. The man frowned. Earl pointed toward the clutch housing. When your father parked it, the clutch was worn almost to the end of its adjustment. Hydraulics were leaking. It was getting harder to start. Then he pointed toward the engine. But 35 years created a different set of problems. Corrosion, bad fuel, stuck components, failed hoses, damaged wiring, deteriorated seals. The tractor Earl dragged home was not exactly the tractor that had been parked in 1989. Time had added its own failures. The owner ran his hand across the hood. So the engine wasn't blown? Doesn't look like it. The man became quiet. My dad always said he'd get back to it. Earl looked toward the collapsed equipment shed. Probably meant to. That was how machines disappeared. Not always with a broken crankshaft. Not always with smoke pouring from the engine. Sometimes a newer tractor arrived. The old one needed a clutch. Then harvest came, then winter, then another year. A machine that had worked for decades could become something nobody needed by simply sitting still long enough. The owner smiled. You going to restore it now? Earl looked at the rust. No, you've come this far. I did restore it. The man laughed. Earl didn't. I restored what it does. He climbed back onto the seat. Behind the tractor was the same field it had worked decades earlier. Earl had brought a light implement with him. Nothing dramatic. Nothing selected to make the tractor look stronger than it was. Just work appropriate for an old machine returning to service. He connected it, checked the hitch, started the engine. This time it fired without the long struggle of that first day. The idle settled. Oil pressure came up. Earl waited for the temperature to begin moving before selecting gear. Then the tractor entered the field. The implement lowered. The engine note deepened. Behind Earl the ground changed, slowly, steadily. The owner stood beside Ray and watched. There was no fresh paint flashing in the sunlight. No polished chrome. No transformation that could be understood from a before and after photograph. The transformation was happening underneath. The clutch transferred power. The cooling system carried heat away. Oil circulated through an engine that had once been assumed dead. Hydraulics raised and lowered the implement. The tractor pulled, turned, worked. At the end of the first pass, Earl stopped. He checked the gauges, then looked behind him. 35 years ago, this machine had left work unfinished. Now there was a fresh line through the field. Earl turned around. Another pass, then another. Ray waited until Earl returned to the barn. You know what everybody's going to say. Earl shut the engine off. What? That you brought a dead tractor back to life. Earl shook his head. No looked at him. Earl climbed down. It wasn't dead when they parked it. He glanced at the old owner. That was the part everybody missed. The engine hadn't miraculously survived a catastrophic failure. The evidence suggested there may never have been one. A worn clutch, hydraulic leaks, hard starting. Then a newer machine arrived. What began as temporary storage became 35 years. Those 35 years nearly created the failure. Everyone later assumed had come first. Earl put one hand on the faded hood. When he'd found the tractor, weeds had grown around the wheels so thickly that it seemed to belong to the ground. Now those same wheels were covered in fresh soil. That was enough restoration for him. For 35 years, everyone who saw the tractor asked the same question. How could an engine survive sitting that long? Earl had asked a better one. Whoever proved the engine was the reason it stopped?